Thanks so much. And good to see everybody here, and good to have everybody here in the auditorium, and also those who are watching online. Thanks for joining us. We are continuing our study of the book of Second Samuel. We are at chapter 11, and we are at a major turning point in the story of David because up to this point, we've seen David, basically the good side of David, and the man after God's own heart, the man who basically walks and talks and sleeps and dreams about God, and uh, very careful to follow His will, and who has been blessed by God in so many ways, and actually has turned into not only the most successful king in Israel to this point, but probably in the entire world, the known world at this time. And we're about to see here something very, very different in the life of David. If you've ever read any of the history of Lyndon Johnson that's been written by Robert Caro, one of his forwards, Robert Caro talks about this brilliant stream, kind of like two chords that are sewn together. One is this brilliant, lustrous, beautiful chord, and then there's another chord that's very dark and not so lustrous, not so appealing, but these chords are interwoven. And he said this describes the life and the legacy of Lyndon Johnson. Well, it also describes the life and the legacy of King David, as we're about to find out as we open into chapter 11 in the book of Second Samuel. If you please turn there in your Bibles or in your tablets. And the chapter 11 begins innocently enough, kind of like a once upon a time aspect to it. The writer says, in the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. And those are some place names that we read about last week in chapter 10. This may be the battle that we were studying in chapter 10 last week. A little bit more of a detail, or this battle, the writer is taking us back during this time of the battle while that's going on. So David's men are out. David's mighty men, as some translations might put it, are out fighting the good fight. But David remained in Jerusalem apparently for no particular reason. If there was one, it's not given. There probably is no reason. You kind of get the sense that David is not paying attention to details here because, the opening verse talks about, hey, it's spring. It's the time when kings go off to war. Well, first of all, you wait until spring because the fighting conditions are just less than ideal during the winter. Come spring, hey, when spring comes around, you have blue bonnets, and beautiful blue bonnets this year, by the way. You have blue bonnets and you have war. And so David's fighting men are out doing their job. David is not leading them. And it's very interesting that in chapter 10, if this is the same battle, Joab goes out and there's really there's not much fighting going on, but there seems to be no resolution of the battle either. It just seems to be going on. David's not there. David's back in Jerusalem. We don't know why. Maybe even David doesn't know why. It's when you look at the lives of many famous people, you find out that sometimes they will tell you that the most difficult parts of their lives, but not when they were struggling, when they were having moments of failure. The most difficult moments of their lives occurred when they were successful. People can cope with difficulty and maybe outright failure, sometimes better than they can cope with success. You know, when success comes around, and David was a very successful king. There's no argument there. They just don't know what to do with themselves. Maybe that's where David is right now. Because, verse 2, one evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of his palace. Now, most translations say it's the evening. The evening, if you look at the original Hebrew, could also stand for the afternoon hours. Does that sound weird? Well, I remember when I was 8 years old and I had this extended conversation with my grandfather Williams about how to describe the time of day, because we were going to go over and visit some relatives, and he said, yeah, we'll go over this evening and visit with your Aunt Fanny. And I thought, oh, well, we'll do that after supper. No. Come around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, packed everything up, and drove over to see Aunt Fanny. And so we had this discussion. Hey, I thought we were going this evening. Well, it is this evening. Really? Yeah. And, here's how you tell the time of day. Those early hours, we call that the morning. And then the hours after lunch, that's the evening. And then when the sun goes down, we call that night. Well, Grandpa, that just doesn't make any sense at all. So on and on and on and on. Fabulous conversation. I'm sure you wanted to be there. But anyway, bottom line of all this is that it's probably, it may be at night. It could also be during the afternoon. David doesn't have a lot on his schedule. In fact, it looks like he's taking a nap or something, or he's trying to take a nap. He's restless. He gets up. He walks around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. Oh. Now, there's a discussion about, where was she bathing? Well, it's possible she could have been doing it in the courtyard of her house. More likely, she was probably inside if she was a very circumspect young woman. And somehow, David caught sight of her through the window. The woman was very beautiful. Ah, well, David, look away. Give her a little bit of space. And if that's as much as he had done, everything would have been cool, Life would have gone on. David would continue to be the absolute good guy. David did something else. We call this little episode temptation, right? Could be. Maybe a little temptation. Nothing wrong in temptation. In fact, if you go into the letters of Paul, he'll tell you it's not if, but when you'll be tempted. It's just part of life. The issue becomes, what do you do when you're tempted? Do you walk away from it? Or do you act on it? David acts on it. Or at least he kind of does, well, I'm just going to check things out. No harm in that. Verse 3, David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, she is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Those names really don't mean all that much to us. They should have meant something to David. This isn't just any young woman who was taking a bath. She's the wife of Uriah. And if you go over toward the end of 2 Samuel, in fact, very likely when we get into that section of 2 Samuel, we're probably going to gloss over it because it's almost like a directory of names. But Uriah is listed as one of David's mighty men. In fact, Uriah is out on the battle line right now fighting David's battle. Not only that, Bathsheba's daddy, Eliam, is also one of David's mighty men. She's related to two key elements of David's fighting force. Not one, but two. That should have been a cautionary tale if for David to consider. But he's considering the wrong things. He says, hey, this is a fabulously beautiful woman. And this thought enters into her. I gotta have her. I gotta have her. Again, he could have stopped there. But there's something going on in his head where he says, not only do I want her, I can have her. And I can do it because everybody out is out of town. I can do whatever I want to do, and nobody will ever know. So, verse 4, David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. Now, she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanness. This is a parenthetical here, and it's kind of like, isn't that a little TMI? Why you need to let us know that? Well, we are informed of that because when what is about to happen happens, there can be no doubt in the reader's mind that David is responsible for what is about to happen. She went back home, verse 5, the woman conceived and sent word to David saying, I am pregnant. Uh-oh. This is a problem. And we're not talking about, paternity issues and so forth. This is serious, serious business, especially in that day and time, especially in that culture. You're talking about a situation where if two people are caught in the act of adultery, under the law of Moses, it's quite possible that not just one, but both of them could be put to death. Now, maybe David is thinking, hey, who's going to come up and try to get me arrested and stoned to death? That's probably not the biggest deal on his mind. But there is the issue of scandal. This is going to make me look bad when it becomes obvious that Bathsheba has become pregnant. It begins to show. Word's going to get around. People are going to remember that, hey, weren't there some officials from David's palace who came over and they brought her over to the king's palace? And that timeline would be just about right. I wonder what's going on. I wonder what the king has done. And if David has any concern for Bathsheba, I'm sure the thought is, hey, I've got to protect my reputation. I've got to protect this young woman's life from being snuffed out. So, what's David's plan? The great plan A would have been for him to go to God and say, Lord, I've got a problem. I have sinned. What do I do? And go from there. That would have been the greatest plan A. It's really interesting that sometimes when people who get into and commit specific behaviors, specific acts that turn out to be that they're not proud of, in fact, they're embarrassed by it, they're just caught up in it. And if they are Christians, the last thing they do is take it to the Lord in prayer. That should be your first step. For a lot of folks, that's not any step at all. It's not, probably because they're too embarrassed to talk to God about it. It's kind of the mentality, the mindset seems to be, well, if I don't mention it to God, he won't know. God knows. No doubt about it. So that should have been David's plan A. Instead, he goes to plan B. The men are out still fighting the battle. David sent this word to Joab, his nephew, who's in charge of the army. Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent him to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked him how Joab was, how the soldiers were, and how the war was going. You can imagine what's going through Uriah's mind. Your commander comes up, "Hey, Uriah, you're wanted back in Jerusalem. Go talk to the king." So he packs up, goes to the king, thinking, "Hey, this must be a top secret assignment or something like that." He sits down with the king. The king says, "Hey, Uriah, how are things going? How's that How's that big lug of a nephew of mine? How's he doing leading the war?" "Yeah, huh, yeah, he has his little, he's got his little personality quirks, but yeah, he's pretty good." "Well, how's the morale? And how are you doing? You think you guys are going to come out okay on the war? And just small talk upon small talk upon small talk. Uriah must have been thinking, the king brought me all the way back here for this. But hey, he's a faithful soldier. Yeah, I'll go along with it. And then, verse 8, David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." Not just wash his feet. The idea is, hey, Uriah, you've come a long way. Everybody's missed you. Why don't you go spend the night at your house? I'm sure the little woman will be very happy to see you. Nod, nod, wink, wink. And the thought is, yeah, Uriah will spend the night with Bathsheba, and things will kind of work out on their own. When Bathsheba becomes pregnant, or it's obvious, people will assume, well, that's Uriah's child. It doesn't work out that way. Even though David sends kind of like a fruit basket along, I want to make you really, really comfortable, have a really, really fun night. Well, Uriah's fun night is to not even go anywhere near his house. Verse 9, he slept at the entrance to the palace with all his master's servants and did not go down to his house. David was told Uriah did not go home. Uh-oh. So he asked Uriah, "Haven't you just come from a military campaign? Why didn't you go home?" Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Joab and my lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing." You got to say this about Uriah. He's got integrity. He says, "I may be back home, but I'm still on a military mission. And if my coworkers can't do what I might be doing here, I'm not going to do it. I am one with my coworkers, with my fellow soldiers, and I'm going to suffer the same kind of hardships they're encountering on the battlefield, even if I am back here in Jerusalem." Well, David thinks, well, let's try this again. Verse 12, David tells him, "Stay here one more day, and tomorrow I'll send you back." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. At David's invitation, he ate and drank with him, and David made him drunk. Man, yeah, try some of these. We have some really wonderful wines coming in from the field. You really should sniff the metal cap from this bottle. It has a very nice bouquet, and this one is in its own decorated box. Really, really outstanding wines. Well, one thing leads to another. Uriah does get drunk. The thought being that he'll just lose all sense of judgment. At some point, he'll get up, start singing, "Show me the way to go home." And they'll push him in the right direction. Well, it doesn't work. Uriah may be drunk, but he still is hanging on to his principles here. Because in the evening, Uriah went out to sleep on his mat among his master's servants. He did not go home. David is probably getting very desperate here. What he thought was going to be a simple solution to covering up what has happened is not working out. He's gone through plan B, plan C. He's gone through all the letters of the alphabet. He's at plan Z and running out of options here. So he figures, okay, there's only one more thing to do. Verse 14. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In it, he wrote, "Put Uriah out in front where the fighting is fiercest, then withdraw from him so that he will be struck down and die." This is probably the most heinous thing we'll ever read about David. David, how could you do such a thing? Well, we are amazed, and probably everyone, even including David, may have been amazed, even as he was writing out the orders. But sometimes, if you're not careful, that slippery slope, you wind up, along the way, you wind up doing some very shocking things. For David, this is one of them. And Uriah, being the upright man that he is, carries the order, carries basically his death warrant back to Joab, not even reading it, not realizing, not even suspecting what's about to happen. Verse 16, while Joab had the city under siege, he put Uriah at a place where he knew the strongest defenders were. When the men of the city came out and fought against Joab, some of the men in David's army fell. Moreover, Uriah the Hittite died. Mission accomplished. Joab sent David a full account of the battle. He instructed the messenger, "When you've finished giving the king this account of the battle, the king's anger may flare up, and he may ask you, 'Why did you get so close to the city to fight? Didn't you know they would shoot arrows from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, son of Jerubbesheth? Didn't a woman drop an upper millstone on him from the wall so that he died in Thebes?'" This sounds familiar to you for some of you who have been attending the Wednesday night class on Judges. This is out of chapter 9 in the book of Judges, if you want to read that up. If he asks you this, then say to him, "Moreover, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead." The messenger set out, and when he arrived, he told David everything Joab had sent him to say. The messenger said to David, "The men overpowered us and came out against us in the open, but we drove them back to the entrance of the city gate. Then the archer shot arrows at your servants from the wall, and some of the king's men died. Moreover, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead." Now, this should have been pretty shocking news. Remember, Uriah is one of the mighty men. He's not just any soldier. He is a man of standing in this army. It's kind of like if you go back to D-Day, and at some point, General Eisenhower gets on the phone to President Roosevelt and says, "Well, we had a bad day, or we had a pretty good invasion on D-Day, but something bad happened. The other side got to General Patton and General Bradley and killed them. We've lost two of our best generals." What do you think Roosevelt's response would have been? Very, very downcast at the very least. Very disappointed. Maybe even shocked. This shouldn't have happened. What are we going to do? We've lost one, maybe two of our best men. David should have had that kind of response. Look at what he says, verse 25. "Say this to Joab. Don't let this upset you. The sword devours one as well as another. Press the attack against the city and destroy it." Say this to encourage Joab. So philosophical. Hey, it's war. People are gonna die. Gee willikers. Doggone it. That's too bad, but tell Joab not to let him down. Yeah, that's a nice message to carry back to Joab. But between David and Joab, this is a coded message to Joab saying, "Thanks for doing my dirty work for me." When Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him, as under Mosaic law, at least the minimum of 10 days. After the time of mourning was over, David had her brought to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. And so, problem solved. Not only that, you can imagine if they were doing popularity polls back in the day, David's reputation probably soared. Oh man, we were so sad to lose Uriah, but look at that. Look at what David has done. David took that poor man's widow who otherwise might have just gone destitute, and he takes her in. Not only takes her into his household, he makes her a queen. David is such a wonderful guy. Aren't we lucky to have such a great king? Everything just should have been great for David. And maybe he thought, hey, this is all behind us. Every problem was solved. Every problem except one. The thing David had done displeased the Lord. So chapter 12, it's several months later, maybe about a year later, shortly after the baby has been born. And the Lord sent the prophet Nathan to David. Now, we've already been introduced to Nathan in chapter 7. He's the guy to whom David said, I really want to build a temple for the Lord, a house for the Lord. And Nathan gave him God's initial approval before God said, no, not so fast, Nathan. So we got a relationship there. A relationship where Nathan can pretty much come in, sit down, maybe have a cup of coffee with David, and they engage in kind of an opening conversation. And then Nathan says to David, hey, David, I got the story for you. There were two men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in its arms. It was like a daughter to him. And keep in mind, this was probably pretty common back in the day. They would have felt about a little baby lamb the way we feel about our dogs. And remember, at that point in time, dogs were not considered high on the list of household pets. Nobody would have held a dog in their arms, but they would have held this little lamb, this little cuddly lamb that the poor man loved like a daughter. Verse 4. Now, a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him. That's the story. Nathan settles back, looks for the response. He gets the response that he's looking for. Verse 5, David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, as surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He deserves to die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity. That's a pretty strong response for David for a story that he doesn't even know for sure that it's true. I mean, the names have been changed to protect the innocent, but that kind of thing. But David doesn't even check for the details. He sees the wrong that has been done in this story, and he's on it with a great deal of ferociousness. In psychology class, they call that projection, where people just come down hard on somebody for a particular behavior or actions. They condemn that kind of behavior, and they condemn it very strongly because they see that kind of behavior in themselves. That's the kind of response Nathan and God are looking for. In condemning this man, David has condemned himself. Verse 7, Nathan said to David, "You are the man. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave your master's house to you and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah. And if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be her own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now, therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. This is what the Lord says. Out of your own household I am going to bring calamity on you. Before your very eyes I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight. You did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel." Well, David knows where he stands. And the response that we get from David here, there's only one thing for him to say. And think of the things he could have said. You know, lots of folks, when they're confronted with bad behavior to account for themselves, the excuse machine just starts rolling. Man, don't get righteous with me. Good grief. If you only knew all the trouble I've been having to deal with, the work at the job, at the office, people, we're not meeting our targets, we're not meeting our expectations. I go home and the kids are acting up and supper's late, or when it's on the table, it's burned. Nothing's going right in my life, and I have all these pressures. If you only knew what I needed to do to make life a little more comfortable for me. And besides, your life is not all that righteous yourselves. Well, David could have said that, but he knows Nathan is right because God is right. There's only one thing for David to say, and he says it, verse 13. He says, I have sinned against the Lord. I can't repeat the Hebrew phrase, but basically it's two words. And it works out to sin against God, sin against Yahweh. Well, Nathan has good news and bad news. Nathan replied, the Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. Something that could have happened to David because of his sin of adultery. Now, granted, probably no one would have been nervy enough to try to arrest David and have him carted away, but that would not have been a problem with God. If God determined that he really wanted to punish David for his sin, he could have handled it very instantaneously. No problem. But he has God's assurance that he will be spared that kind of outcome. You're not going to die, David, but because by doing this you've shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die. Good news, David, you're not going to die. Bad news, you're forgiven. Bad news, you won't die, but your son will, your newborn son. Because there's a consequence to this sin. And isn't it interesting that in the Bible, so often, that when there is sin, and when atonement needs to be made for sin, someone or something innocent has to pay for that sin. And David doesn't have to wait long for that consequence to begin. Verse 15, after Nathan had gone home, the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife had borne to David, and he became ill. David pleaded with God for the child. He fasted and spent the nights lying in sackcloth on the ground. The elders of his household stood beside him to get him up from the ground, but he refused, and he would not eat any food with them. On the seventh day, the child died. David's attendants were afraid to tell him that the child was dead, for they thought, while the child was still living, he wouldn't listen to us when we spoke to him. How can we now tell him the child is dead? He may do something desperate. The prince has died. The baby prince is gone. But don't tell the king. We don't know what to do. Well, maybe we keep your voice down. He might hear you. You know how that goes on when somebody is whispering? Don't raise your voice. Don't say anything. But you pick up on it anyway because there's something about the tone of voice, even when they're whispering, trying to keep it quiet. You know something's going on. This happens to David. He noticed his attendants were whispering among themselves, and he realized the child was dead. Is the child dead? He asked. Yes, they replied. He's dead. Then David got up from the ground. After he had washed, put on lotions, and changed his clothes, he went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. Then he went to his own house, and at his request they served him food, and he ate. Complete change of behavior for David. This really amazes his attendants. They asked him, "Why are you acting this way? While the child was alive, you fasted and wept, but now that the child is dead, you get up and eat." David answered, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows, the Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he's dead, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me." Then David comforted his wife Bathsheba. Very interesting. Here, for the first time in a long time, Bathsheba is called by her first name, her real name. She's no longer is she the wife of Uriah. She is Bathsheba, and she's also identified as David's wife. He comforted her, and he went to her and made love to her. She gave birth to a son, and they named him Solomon. Yes, that's Solomon. The Solomon who became the richest, the wisest, the most powerful king Israel would ever know, and from whom Solomon, the house of David, would continue to develop, and with multiple and subsequent generations leading up to, yes, Jesus Christ. The Lord loved Solomon, and because the Lord loved him, he sent word through Nathan the prophet to name him Jedediah, which means loved by the Lord. Meanwhile, Joab, oh yes, back to the battle. We've, all this stuff going on. We forgot there's a war back there. Joab fought against Rabbah of the Ammonites and captured the royal citadel. Joab then sent messengers to David saying, "I have fought against Rabbah and taken its water supply. Hey, major move here. Just try to count the days that you can go without water. We got a lock on them. Victory is about to be ours. Now muster the rest of the troops and besiege the city and capture it. Otherwise, I will take the city, and it'll be named after me. Hey, David, you better haul yourself over here really quick, or else I'm going to get all the glory about winning this battle." So David mustered the entire army and went to Rabbah and attacked and captured it. And it's interesting. This tracks what we were reading in chapter 10 about that particular battle. David took the crown from their king's head, and it was placed on his own head. It weighed a talent of gold, and it was set with precious stones. Talent of gold. That meant that the crown weighed at least 75 pounds. David had a really good neck, don't you think? Man, I don't think I could last 20 minutes wearing something that heavy on my head. David took a great quantity of plunder from the city and brought out the people who were there, consigning them to labor with saws and with iron picks and axes, and he made them work at brick making. David did all this to all the Ammonite towns. Then he and his entire army returned to Jerusalem. You know, out of this, there are two Psalms that kind of are bookends to this particular chapter, a very unhappy chapter in our story and in the life of David. And when you have some time this week, you might want to read them. One of the Psalms is Psalm 32. I won't read the whole thing here, but I'll just read 2 or 3 verses here, where David writes, "When I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was sapped as in the heat of summer. Then I acknowledged my sin to you and did not cover up my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin." Gives you something of an insight into what was going on inside David's head, even when he thought he was getting away with what he was getting away with. He thought he had all the bases covered. He thought even, well, you know, God hasn't done anything bad to me, so I'm home free. But still, there was that hollow feeling inside of him. He knew something was not right. It felt like he really was wasting away. He did not have the kind of feeling, the kind of intimacy that he had with God when he was doing the right thing. That's Psalm 32. And then there's also Psalm 51, which in the foreword explicitly points out that David wrote the psalm when the prophet Nathan came to him after David had committed adultery with Bathsheba. And again, I'll just read a couple of verses, beginning with verse 3. "For I know my transgressions, and my sin is always before me. Against you, you only, have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight." David obviously sinned against so many people in what he did. He sinned against Bathsheba. He definitely sinned against Uriah. He sinned against Joab in making Joab, and for that matter, all number of people who worked for David, do his dirty work and do something that they knew was not the right thing to do, and to look the other way. He sinned against all these people, but at the end of the day, he sinned against God because he broke God's commandments. And then skip down to verse 16. You, Lord, do not delight in sacrifice, or I would bring it. You do not take pleasure in burnt offerings. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. Oh God, you will not despise. There's much to be said for confession and repentance, because that is where you feel the full force of God's forgiveness. Yes. One thing leads to another, to another, to another. And at the end, you look back and you can say with complete surprise, I never expected that to happen. That's not what I expected. That's not what I planned for. That's not what I wanted. That's why God condemns adultery. That's right. Absolutely. Well, there is more to come. Unfortunately, this particular element and story of David's life continues as we work our way through 2 Samuel. If you will, please read chapters 13 and 14. That'll be our lesson for next Sunday. And Lord willing, that's where we'll pick up again to talk about the story of David. Thanks so much for your time. I hope you enjoyed the lesson, got something out of it. And have a great week. And see you next week.